Welcome to RHI Sociable City Interviews, where we meet with global thought leaders on nightlife and the social economy. Today we are with Jamin Rowan, a professor at Brigham Young University and author of The Sociable City, an American intellectual tradition. His research focuses on American literature, urban culture, and the neuroscience of storytelling. He created the Provo City Lab, where students collaborate with the city to enhance urban design and community development.
Well, hello there. It's so great to be with you again. And it was great to see you in Salt Lake City. And it was good to reconnect and to learn more about the incredible research that you're doing. But just to begin with, can you just kind of give a little bit of a background of who you are, where you're from, kind of like how you ended up doing what you're doing?
Sure. Yeah, great to be with you. And yes, good to have seen you in Salt Lake City. I'm Jamin Rowan. I'm an associate professor here at Brigham Young University. I'm housed in the English department, but I also currently run the American Studies program here at BYU. My research focuses on kind of the intersection of urban design, urban planning, and the stories, the narratives that we use to tell about life in cities. And I've also been really interested in taking my research and my work beyond into the city in which I live. So I've served on the City Planning Commission here in Provo for 6 years. I am currently a board member of an activist kind of group in Provo here called Bike Walk Provo that really promotes active transportation and kind of walkable urban design. And I teach a course here on campus called the Provo City Lab. I've been doing that for the past 6-7 years, in which students on campus from a variety of different majors work with Provo City and other entities like the Utah Transit Authority on kind of community development, urban design projects. So really interested intellectually in cities, but also really interested in creating better spaces where I live right now and helping other people, especially students, do the same.
Which leads me to the next point. I came to know you because you published a book called The Sociable City. And that's the name of our annual event, the
Yeah.
Sociable City Summit and Sociable City Academy, and everything we do is Sociable City. So it was so coincidental, and I know we had you come and speak. And your work really is informative. I think you define it a bit differently than I would, but why don't you talk about how you ended up not only writing that book, but coming up with that term, sociable city? Because I remember I got that term from a guy who studies the history of the Paris cafes,
Right.
and he mentioned the term sociable city. I said, "Oh, that's a good term." So
Yeah.
so how did you arrive to do the research that you did? What's the basic foundation of what you cover, and how did you think of it becoming just the sociable city?
Yeah, great questions, Jim. And yeah, I really loved participating in that Sociable City Summit back in New Orleans. I think it was in the pre-pandemic days, and really a big fan of the work that you're doing with your organization and your conferences. I just a little bit of backstory to how I came to write The Sociable City. I grew up in California in the 1980s into the 1990s, a time when maybe our culture wasn't quite at the height of its anti-urbanism. I'd say that the 80s were perhaps one of the many peaks of anti-urbanism that we've arrived at. But I grew up really afraid of city life. I grew up in a relatively small town, Merced, in the Central Valley of California. And the nearest city to me was the kind of San Francisco, Oakland, the Bay Area. I would go into the Bay Area to watch, like the San Francisco Giants play, but that was about it. Most of the information I got about cities during the 1980s, early 1990s, was made me very afraid of living in cities, and so I grew up really anxious about that. Well, I went to school. I came here to school in Utah at Brigham Young University, and then I decided to go to graduate school in Boston. I attended Boston College. And I was quite anxious about moving to Boston because of these kind of stories that my culture had fed me. Well, when I arrived in Boston, I was totally unprepared and very surprised by how much I loved living in that city. I just found myself not only feeling safe, but I found myself really delighted by my exchanges with strangers on the streets, in the subways, in the other public spaces. And nothing in my culture had prepared me for how satisfying, how delightful I found those encounters and those informal relationships that I had with my fellow Bostonians. And when I was at the kind of beginning of my PhD program, well, actually, I guess it was the second year of my master's program at Boston College. I took a course from a guy named Carlo Rotella, who's written a book. He's written lots of books, but the book that I read from him was called October Cities. That was one of the first ones. But he taught a course on the city in American literature and culture. And not necessarily as part of that course, but shortly thereafter, I just became really interested in urban literature and culture. And then I read Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And it was the first book really that I had read that had explained to me adequately why I found those encounters in those public spaces, in those third spaces, so enjoyable, so meaningful. And I recognized that Jacobs was, of course, a lot of people have built upon Jacobs' work. A lot of urban studies scholars, urban planners, designers cite her as a kind of foundational text for a really different way of thinking about the cities. But Jacobs herself actually is drawing upon a longer historical tradition of thinking about cities in a kind of countercultural way, different from the way that mainstream American culture tended to think about cities. And so this book, the Sociable City that I came to write, was an attempt to, in a lot of ways, uncover that intellectual tradition that Jacobs herself is drawing upon. I was trying to say that there isn't necessarily a large tradition, but there is a tradition of thinkers in the U.S. who've tried to make sense of and tried to help people around them find value in those informal encounters with strangers in public spaces as a way to counter the predominant narrative, which is that the only relationships that matter are private, intimate, really close friendships. And so, those are people like people that come out of the settlement house movement at the turn of the century and early 20th century. People like the New Yorker writers and other urban journalists in those kind of early days of the New Yorker 1930s and 40s. I talk about a group of kind of urban ecologists in the mid 20th century that kind of the people who find ecology as a way, as a discourse to respond to the urban renewal forces, the forces of urban renewal that come into cities and kind of rip up neighborhoods and other urban infrastructure to make way for highways and other plazas. Anyways, so that's the book. It's an intellectual history that kind of leads up to and culminates in Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great American Cities. The interesting thing, you asked about the title of the book. The interesting thing is that I think the title of the dissertation, the kind of original version of my book was Sympathy in the City, or something along those lines. I originally really used this term sympathy as a way to describe those exchanges between strangers. But in a lot of ways, sympathy had been so co-opted by kind of the forces on the other side of that intellectual history, people who valued private, intimate relationships, that I began searching for a different term, that when people encountered sympathy, they immediately thought of, well, sympathy only exists in really close, intimate relationships. And so I began searching for another term at the encouragement of my publisher and readers who had read the manuscript, and landed upon this idea of sociability. And I don't think I found it through the source that you're describing, Jim, but I felt like, okay, that's a term that doesn't have the same connotations as sympathy. It doesn't have the same kind of intimacy that's implied. Sociable I think, is a term that stops at those kind of public, informal encounters. So that's how I came up with the term sociable city. It was not my original title, but a title that I came to pretty late in the process, actually.
Mhm. When you mentioned the settlement houses, I remember reading that in the book, and it made me think about, it was just a group of people who were trying to integrate the migration of the blacks from the South into the community and help them get connected to resources and other things, or other immigrants too from
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Europe
settlement
as
houses
well.
were, yeah, primarily aimed, at least initially, towards integrating predominantly European immigrants.
Mhm.
And then, of course, there were also settlement houses that were geared towards, yeah, Black migrants from the South to those northern and Midwestern cities.
But we're seeing within cities, this kind of now you have these what are called pop-up events, and they're events that are being created by people in fields or parking lots or in their own homes. Often, very much uh, places for people who might not have traditional experiences to where to socialize. And, they're just acting or things are happening that are so contrary to kind of the normative society. But it's just that they don't have other places, or they don't know how to integrate or how to create better, safer, more, you know, um, you know, responsible spaces. So I always think about that whole idea of a group that could help people who are outside of the norm or outside of the mainstream. They've been isolated because of inequities in their upbringing or education or economic status. And then when they try to get integrated into a more normative social experience, they
Yeah.
just don't know how to behave. And I'm seeing this to some extent with that 16 to 20-year-old during COVID now are entering their early 20s, going into social spaces, but they didn't have those years of actual socializing because they spent most of their years in school online or getting into chat rooms or gaming or something like that. And now they're in the public space. A lot of venue operators report that their behavior is disruptive or not consistent with what would be expected. So it seems like there's always a need to help orient people to be better integrated into a social environment
Right.
or a community or a culture. Um, so that made me think about that.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you have any opinion about that, but it's just a more contemporary issue that I see is groups of people that are not fitting in.
Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about reminds me actually of I write about in the introduction to my book about Frederick Law Olmsted, and that's really what Central Park was designed to do. He designed Central Park as a way to kind of teach the masses of how to engage with each other, and I critique the way that he went about doing it. There was really distinct kind of class biases there, and but then there are other public spaces or semi-public spaces that did it in a slightly different way. But yeah, I think that all over cities we have attempts that people make to teach people how to integrate, how to behave in public. And I think that we can, some spaces do that better than other spaces do.
Mhm, mhm. Now, I was fascinated when I learned about your new research because people always call me a storyteller.
Yeah,
And I've been to storyteller conferences, and there's a whole art to storytelling. Anybody who listens to the show The Moth knows
right.
that some people do it really well and really
Yeah.
get you engaged, and some people don't. But why don't you talk about this research that you're doing about storytelling, both from a storyteller and a listener's perspective?
Yeah, I'd love to. I started teaching a course about 3 years ago with one of my colleagues who's in the experience design and management department here at BYU. We had the opportunity to co-teach a course, and we decided that we would teach it on, it's called The Art of Transformative Storytelling. And we actually have been using for that course a book that the Moth organizers put out called How to Tell a Story, and was really helpful here. But our idea was that we wanted to help students on campus learn how to tell stories, or in other words, develop storytelling competencies that they could use to address their own kind of personal needs and challenges and questions, as well as how to use storytelling as a way to address larger social challenges, needs, issues. And it was just a really fun course. So we started out kind of focused on that, but one of the things that we did is over the course of the first month of this course, students would develop a personal story, and then they would perform it at a moth-style story slam for each other. And these were stories that started out of their own needs. We had students identify a need that they had at the moment that they were telling the course, and then develop a story. From a storytelling perspective, there are people that talk about, every story is set in motion by a character's want or need. And then most stories consist of those characters trying to meet those needs or achieve those wants and failing to do so completely, right? That's the kind of rising action of a story. And then stories always, or almost always, climax when a character either achieves that need or thinks about their need in a different way, has an insight about their need in some way that enables them to have some kind of insight to move forward upon. And so this is the structure that we help students develop their stories around. And then we had them perform their stories at a moth story slam. And what we were unprepared for in this course was how special that exchange of stories was. It was, in a lot of ways, quite a sacred experience that students really connected with each other as they told their stories about, often quite vulnerable stories, and as they listened to each other's really vulnerable stories. And it was just an amazing experience. And we decided, my co-teacher and I decided that we wanted to take this story slam to the wider campus community. And so we've only just been doing this, but we started hosting these campus-wide story slams over this past year. And one of the things that happened along the way is that we ran into one of our colleagues in the Department of Linguistics, who is really interested in neuroimaging and hyperscanning. He has this technology called FNIRS, which is just a headband that you can wear that measures neural activity by basically seeing which parts of your brain are oxygenated at a particular moment. And so during these story slams, we had storytellers wearing these headbands along with 4 members of the audience wearing these headbands. And that enables us to see how storytellers and listeners' brains were behaving during a story. And we marked those stories with different kind of timestamps based on particular storytelling elements or narrative structure, points in the narrative structure. So we could see at what points in a story were the storyteller and the listener's brains coupling, like when was their brain activity synchronous and kind of moving along the same neural patterns, and when weren't they? Anyways, so we're just at the very beginning of this research, but we're really, really interested in kind of just thinking about what happens to our brains as we tell and listen to stories, and might there be a neuroscientific way to explain the kind of emotional connection that we feel when we tell and listen to stories.
Yeah, well, this is fascinating. I mean, I just love this because, I'm a storyteller, and sometimes you really know when you're connecting with somebody. You could see their facial expressions change or their body language changes. You can feel it. And then, sometimes when I'm speaking to a large group, you probably know this yourself, especially if you're leading a long session, you could begin to see attentiveness kind of disappear,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's an interesting study, and it also could, it seems to me like what you're doing is you're arming students for their future, because a lot of success in their career or their relationships always will revolve around their ability to tell stories in a way that people will want to listen, but not necessarily have them get tired of what it is that you're telling. unfortunately, my wife has heard my same story over and over and over and over again, even though other people really enjoy them, you know.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, but I think that's the idea, is that especially with the neuroscientific angle, we can help people understand what parts of stories really tend to get people on that same kind of neural wavelength as the storyteller. And so yeah, the hope is that we can help people tell better stories.
so if you look at it from the perspective of sociability, what value is storytelling to creating these social and sociability experiences?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that as we think about the role of stories in urban spaces, I think it's something that we all crave. That we love hearing people's stories, and you can see this crop up in a lot of different places. I don't know if you're familiar with the social media account Humans of New York. Right, that's an attempt to create a virtual version of this, right? It's someone that goes around and essentially interviews strangers on the streets of New York, and it's spread from there, and then put their stories up on their Instagram account, and it's an extraordinarily popular Instagram account. People love hearing stranger stories. I was in Belfast a couple of years, well, I guess it's just been a year and a half ago now, and they're developing a brand new kind of major cultural center called Belfast Stories. And the idea is that it's essentially a museum in which people come in and just be able to listen to the stories of people who live and have lived in Belfast. And so I do think that we're seeing the importance of and the appeal of stories for people who visit or live in cities, that we love connecting with people. Even when we're people watching, we're often creating stories in our minds about what's happening. We might overhear something, but oftentimes, even if we don't hear anything, we're just looking at people and we hear stories. So I think that we're seeing in kind of our move towards a kind of experience economy, that storytelling is an increasingly important part of that experience economy in cities. These moth story slams, right? They're held in cities. They're really popular. They're so popular that when I lived in London, I could never get a ticket to one of these story slams there. So yeah, I think there's a real hunger for those stories, because that's what helps us feel connected in this sociable way. Just because we hear a story doesn't mean that we'll become, close, dear friends with somebody. But when we hear a stranger's story, we feel that kind of sociable connection with them. That is a really satisfying, meaningful experience to have.
All right, so as the author of The Sociable City, you got 30 seconds to define what a sociable city is.
Okay. I think sociable cities first value public informal interactions. They say these kinds of interactions are valuable to us. And then second, because they value those interactions, they design cities, they create cities in which people can have those informal chance encounters and enjoy them.
Okay. Well, this has been great. Thank you for taking the time, and I hope to learn more as your research evolves.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for having me on. Always good to chat.
Okay.